They thought she'd forgotten how to feel. But when her children came back uninvited that winter, they didn't find the fragile mother they left behind. They found fire beneath her silence. Snow fell like drifting feathers, soft but relentless, covering the narrow road that wound up to the cabin. From the outside, the place looked timeless. Aged pine walls, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, golden light pulsing faintly through frosted windows. Inside, Margaret Hale sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, watching the flames breathe and die in rhythm with her thoughts. It had been 5 winters since she'd lived alone here, high above the town of Ashbury Hollow. 5 winters since her husband, Charles, passed quietly in his sleep one December morning. 5 winters since her 3 grown children, Lena, Paul, and Grace, had stopped calling, each retreating into their own worlds, too busy, too burdened, too wounded to come home again. Margaret didn't blame them anymore. At least that's what she told herself. She had built this quiet life intentionally, a refuge made of silence and pine, where no one asked her to smile through her grief. She read, tended to her garden, fed the deer that wandered near her porch, and every Sunday she walked to the edge of the frozen lake, whispering her prayers into the cold air. But that December, the air carried a strange heaviness. The snowstorm felt like an omen. Her neighbor and longtime friend, Sheriff Daniel Brooks, had stopped by the night before, insisting she keep her phone close in case the roads closed. "Big storm coming," he warned. "Could be trouble if anyone tries to visit unannounced." Margaret only smiled faintly. "No one's coming, Daniel, except someone was." Just before noon, while the storm thickened into white walls outside, the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the stillness. Margaret froze, the mug slipping slightly in her hand. Through the window, she saw a black SUV, dusted in snow, headlights cutting through the blizzard, 3 silhouettes inside. Her breath caught. When the door burst open, wind howled through the room, scattering ash from the hearth. Lena entered first, impeccably dressed even in chaos, followed by Paul, tall and tense, dragging 2 suitcases, and Grace, her youngest, face half hidden behind a wool scarf. Surprise! Lena's voice was falsely bright, too polished. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Margaret didn't move. Lena, Paul, Grace? Her tone was even, but her eyes glistened with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Paul dropped the suitcases with a thud. "We thought you'd like some company." "It's Christmas. You shouldn't be alone up here," Grace added quietly. "We wanted to make it special this year." Special. The word stabbed like a needle. For years they hadn't shown up, birthdays forgotten, calls unanswered. And now, suddenly, they arrived without warning, expecting warmth, forgiveness, celebration. Margaret swallowed hard, fighting the tremor in her chest. "You drove through a storm without calling," she said softly. "You could have been stranded," Lena shrugged, brushing snow off her designer coat. "We wanted it to be a surprise. I thought you'd be happy. I'm surprised," Margaret admitted, her voice low. "But happy?" Her eyes lingered on their faces, so familiar yet distant, like strangers wearing memories she used to love. "I'm not sure I remember what that feels like." The silence that followed was thick and fragile. Grace looked down. Paul shifted uncomfortably, but Lena straightened her shoulders as if preparing for a fight. "Mom, we didn't come here to argue. We just thought, it's been too long. We can stay a few days, maybe help around the cabin, cook dinner like we used to." "Like we used to?" Margaret turned toward the fire, her face half lit, half shadowed. "You remember the dinners," she whispered. "Do you also remember the silence that followed them? When everyone would leave the table before dessert?" Lena flinched. "That was years ago." "5," Margaret interrupted gently. 5 years. Long enough for grief to turn into dust. Paul sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Mom, we're just trying here. Can't we start fresh?" "Please," Margaret studied him. He looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face carved by stress and pride. Grace's eyes darted nervously between them, full of hope but also guilt. And Lena, still the perfectionist, hid her shame behind polished words. "Start fresh," Margaret repeated. You think showing up in a storm makes that happen? She took a slow breath, set her mug down, and walked toward the door. If you want to stay, fine. But there are rules. You clean after yourselves, you respect this space, and you listen when I speak. Lena frowned. Mom, we're not kids anymore. Then stop acting like ones, Margaret cut in, her tone sharper now, though her eyes still held pain rather than anger. The three of them stood speechless. For the first time in their lives, they saw not the gentle, apologetic woman who had always bent herself around their moods, but someone unyielding, someone reborn. Finally, Margaret sighed. There's soup on the stove. Towels in the hallway. I'll be outside for a bit. Without waiting for a reply, she stepped out into the storm, the cold hitting her face like clarity. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from her chest. Behind her, through the frosted window, she saw her children moving awkwardly, setting down their bags, whispering, unsure. For the first time, she had control of the silence. As snow swirled around her, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered to the wind, "Let this be the winter I finally speak." Inside, the fire cracked loudly, like a promise breaking free from years of quiet restraint. And though the storm raged outside, Margaret smiled faintly. The real storm had just begun inside that house. The storm outside grew heavier, the wind howling through the pine trees like something alive. Inside, the cabin creaked under its weight. Snow pressed against the windows, thick and cold, and the world seemed to shrink to that single, flickering room. Margaret stood by the porch railing, her boots buried in white powder, watching as the snow swallowed the mountain road. She thought about turning them away. Every part of her longed for peace, not confrontation. But peace built on silence wasn't peace at all. It was surrender. When she finally walked back inside, her children were whispering in the kitchen. The smell of burnt toast lingered in the air. Grace jumped slightly when she saw her mother. "We were just trying to make lunch," she said with a nervous laugh. Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. "It's all right, dear. Just don't set the place on fire. It took me months to restore this kitchen." Lena rolled her eyes. "You and your old wood cabinets. Mom, you could have sold this place years ago and moved somewhere comfortable, somewhere closer to us." Margaret's gaze met hers. "Comfort isn't always found in proximity, Lena." Paul leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Still, it's weird. Living up here alone, year after year. Aren't you lonely?" Margaret stirred the pot on the stove, her hand steady. "Sometimes. But loneliness and peace look alike until you learn the difference." "I've learned." No one replied. The clock ticked faintly. She ladled soup into 4 bowls, placed them on the table, and gestured for them to sit. For a while, the only sounds were the soft clinks of spoons against ceramic and the hum of the wind. Then Lena broke the silence. "You know, I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. None of us did. It's just, after Dad passed, everything fell apart. You shut down. We didn't know how to reach you." Margaret's spoon stopped midair. "And did disappearing help?" Lena's jaw tightened. "We needed space, too." "Space," Margaret echoed quietly. "You had 5 years of it." Paul set his spoon down. "Mom, this isn't fair. We came here to reconnect, not to dig up old guilt." Margaret looked at him. Really looked. "You think guilt is the problem?" "No, Paul, it's the pretending. You've all built lives pretending I didn't exist, and now you're pretending that one visit will fix that." The air turned heavy again. Grace's eyes shimmered. "We just want you back," she whispered. Margaret softened a little. "I'm still here, but I'm not the same woman you left." They ate in uneasy quiet. Outside, snowflakes slammed against the window, a constant reminder of how cut off they were from the rest of the world. After lunch, Margaret began clearing the table. Grace moved to help, but Lena caught her wrist. "Let Mom rest. She's stubborn, but she'll tire herself out." Margaret heard it and smiled faintly. "Still think of me as fragile, don't you?" Lena hesitated. "No, maybe just tired." Margaret turned to her, eyes burning with quiet fire. "I was tired of waiting for my children to care. That kind of tiredness changes a person." Lena opened her mouth, then closed it again. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Margaret wiped her hands and opened it to find Sheriff Daniel Brooks, snow covering his coat and hat. "Storm's closing the main road," he said. "You folks are stuck till morning." "Might be longer," Lena sighed dramatically. "Perfect." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Well, ma'am, looks like you've got company for Christmas after all." Margaret smiled politely. "So it seems." Daniel lingered, glancing toward the living room where Paul stood stiffly. "If y'all need anything, radio's still working down at the outpost." "I'll check in tomorrow." When he left, Margaret closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place like a final word. That evening, they gathered in the living room. Margaret lit the oil lamp, its glow spilling across old photographs on the mantel. Her children's faces, frozen in time, smiles from a world that no longer existed. Grace walked over, picking up a framed picture. "This was the summer at Lake Orion, right?" Margaret nodded. "Your father built that dock himself. Said he wanted to give you all a place to leap into something without fear." Paul laughed softly. He nearly fell off it a dozen times. For the first time that night, Margaret smiled genuinely. The warmth was fragile, fleeting, but real. Then Lena spoke, her voice quieter. "I miss him too, Mom, every day. I just couldn't bear coming back here. Everything reminded me of him. And of how lost you looked after." Margaret's eyes filled. "I know, I was lost. But sometimes losing yourself is how you find your truth. I learned to live without waiting for someone to rescue me." Lena's lips trembled. "We didn't mean to abandon you." Margaret walked closer, her hand hovering near Lena's shoulder but not quite touching. "Then why did you wait 5 years to say that?" Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but pride kept them from falling. "Because I didn't think you wanted us anymore." The words hit like a blow. Margaret finally placed a hand on her daughter's arm, gentle yet firm. "I always wanted you. I just stopped begging to be wanted back." That was when the power flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the dull orange glow of the fire. Paul groaned. "Great, just great." Margaret grabbed a flashlight, clicking it on. "The generator's outside in the shed." "I'll check it." "I'll go," Paul said, rising. "You shouldn't be out in that storm." She hesitated, then nodded. "Take the lantern by the door." "Be careful." When he stepped out, snow blasted through the gap before she could close the door. The sound of wind roared like a beast. Grace huddled closer to her mother. "It feels strange here. Like the house remembers everything." Margaret looked at her. "It does. Every room has its echoes." For a long moment, they sat in silence, listening to the old cabin groan under the weight of the storm and of memory. When Paul returned, cheeks red from cold, he was holding something small and metallic. "Found this in the shed," he said, setting it on the table. It was an old brass key, tarnished and worn. Margaret froze. "That key?" "It belonged to your father." "I thought it was lost," Grace whispered. "What's it for?" Margaret stared at it, her face unreadable. "A chest in the attic. One I swore I'd never open again." Lena leaned forward. "Why not?" Margaret met her eyes, voice trembling with weight and mystery. "Because what's inside ended our family once, and I don't know if we can survive it again." The wind howled harder, rattling the windows like angry hands. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the past began to stir. The wind had softened by midnight, but the air inside the house was sharp with unease. The brass key lay on the table like a living thing, small, silent, but full of power. It shimmered faintly under the lantern's glow, a remnant of something unfinished. Margaret hadn't moved since Paul placed it there. She stared at it as if it could speak, as if it carried voices from another lifetime. Her fingers twitched once, but she didn't reach for it. Lena finally broke the silence. "What's in the chest, Mom?" Margaret didn't answer. She turned away and began adding wood to the fire, each log landing with a soft thud. "It's late," she said. "You should all get some rest." Paul frowned. "You can't just say that and expect us to forget it." "Maybe forgetting is the kindest thing," Margaret replied quietly. Grace whispered, "Is it about Dad?" Margaret froze. Her voice, when it came, was barely a breath. "Yes," that single word changed the air. The house seemed to tighten around them. Lena folded her arms, her tone turning sharp. So you've been keeping secrets. About him? After all these years? Margaret turned slowly, the flicker of the fire dancing across her face. Not keeping, protecting. Paul took a step closer. From what? From the truth, she said simply. They exchanged glances, confused, frustrated, afraid. Margaret's calm only made it worse. Finally, she sighed, as if deciding something within herself. Come morning, I'll show you. But not tonight. Some truths need daylight. And with that, she blew out the lantern and left the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. The three siblings sat there, stunned. The fire popped, a log collapsing inward. Outside, the storm groaned softly like it was listening. Grace broke the silence first. What do you think is in it? Paul shrugged. Dad's journals, maybe. Or money, Lena scoffed. Money, please? If it were something simple, she wouldn't look like she'd seen a ghost. Grace looked toward the hallway. She said it ended our family once. Lena's voice dropped. Then maybe it's something about us. No one spoke after that. Each retreated into their own thoughts, haunted by possibilities. Upstairs, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams that Charles had built by hand 30 years ago. She could almost hear his voice, steady, warm, patient. They'll never understand if you keep it locked away, he had told her once. The truth hurts, but silence kills slower. She whispered into the darkness. I was just trying to keep them safe, Charlie. But silence offered no forgiveness. Morning came quietly, pale light slipping through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain cloaked in thick white calm. Margaret rose early, brewed coffee, and stood by the window watching the smoke rise into the still sky. Her children entered one by one, their faces drawn but determined. Without a word, Margaret led them upstairs. The wooden steps creaked beneath their feet, each sound echoing through years of distance. At the top of the hall was a narrow door, barely noticeable, painted the same color as the wall. She reached for the handle, then paused. This room hasn't been opened since the night your father died. Grace's hand trembled. Mom, are you sure? No, Margaret said softly. But it's time. The key turned with a reluctant click. The door opened to a dim attic filled with the scent of cedar and old memories. Dust danced in the sunlight spilling through a cracked window. Boxes lined the walls, some labeled, some not. And there, in the center, sat the chest. It was made of dark oak, heavy and scarred with age. A leather strap crossed its middle, and an iron lock waited silently. Margaret knelt before it. Her fingers shook as she slid the key into the lock. For a moment she hesitated, then turned it. The click echoed through the attic like thunder. When the lid opened, a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of time. Inside lay a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a folded quilt, and a wooden box no bigger than a loaf of bread. Margaret picked up the wooden box and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some black and white, some color. But it was the first one that made Lena gasp. It showed Charles younger, smiling with a woman none of them recognized, her arm around his waist, their faces full of light. Who is that? Paul demanded. Margaret's hands trembled. Her name was Evelyn Grant. She worked with your father before we married. Grace frowned. Was she just a friend? Margaret closed the box. No, she was the woman he almost married. The words fell heavy. Lena's face hardened. So he cheated? Margaret shook her head. Not after we were married. But before we built this family, there was a moment when his heart was divided. He told me the truth before he died. These letters were his. She lifted the tied stack. He wrote to Evelyn for years, but he never sent them. They were apologies, confessions, dreams he buried. Paul looked confused. Then why hide them? Margaret met his eyes, voice breaking. Because your father wanted to tell you himself. But he never got the chance. And She swallowed hard. I couldn't let you see him as less than perfect. You needed to believe in something good when the world turned cruel. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. So all these years you carried that alone? Yes, Margaret whispered. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness. And sometimes forgiveness means protecting the ones you love from truths that serve no healing. Lena stepped forward, anger mixed with sorrow. You kept his secret, but in doing that you built a wall between us. You made us strangers. Margaret's tears finally fell. I know. And I've lived behind that wall every day since. They stood there, 4 hearts bound by pain, surrounded by the ghosts of what once was. Then Grace, voice trembling, said, Mom, can we read the letters? Margaret nodded slowly. If you're ready. They sat on the floor, the quilt spread beneath them. Margaret untied the ribbon and handed each of them a letter. The paper was thin, the handwriting careful and aching. As they read, the attic filled with the sound of quiet sobbing. Charles's words were tender, remorseful, full of love for the family he had built after nearly losing himself. When the last letter was read, no one spoke for a long time. Only the sound of the wind against the eaves reminded them they were still here, still breathing. Finally, Margaret whispered, That's the truth I kept locked away. Not a betrayal, but the reminder that even the best of us are flawed. He loved us, deeply. But he was human. Lena reached out and took her mother's hand. So are you, Mom. And for the first time in 5 years, Margaret didn't pull away. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, landing on the floorboards like soft ribbons of light. I stood in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the old table where my mother used to sit every Sunday, humming hymns while she folded napkins. The sound of the wind brushing against the walls reminded me of the years I had spent away, running from everything that once made me feel alive. Now, standing there, I realized how much of myself had stayed behind in this house, waiting, quietly, for me to come home. After breakfast, I decided to walk down to the old barn. The door creaked open with a haunting familiarity. Dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts, settling over forgotten tools and broken chairs. My father's old coat still hung on a nail near the door. I reached out, touched it, and felt my chest tighten. His scent was long gone, replaced by the musty smell of time, but the memories rushed back as if he were still there, standing tall, proud, and tired. I could almost hear his voice calling me Pumpkin, his tone gentle yet firm, the way fathers speak when they want to protect their daughters from the world, and sometimes from themselves. Behind me, footsteps echoed. It was Ethan. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes scanning the room like he was searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I didn't think you'd come out here, he said softly. I turned to face him, my heart trembling with a mix of sorrow and guilt. This place, it still remembers, I whispered. Ethan nodded. It remembers everything. We stood in silence, the air thick with the weight of things we never said. I wanted to tell him that I missed our laughter, the shared secrets, the way we used to dream together before pride tore us apart. But instead I asked, Why did you come back, Ethan? His answer came slow, hesitant. Because I couldn't forget, he said. No matter how far I went, this place, you, never left me. His words hit me like a storm. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still carried the old wounds, the bitterness from years of silence. You had your chance to fight for us, I replied, trying to sound strong, though my voice cracked halfway through. He stepped closer, the light catching his face, revealing lines that time and regret had carved deep. And I failed, he said. But maybe God's giving me another chance, to make it right. Something inside me softened then, not out of forgiveness, but because I could see how broken he truly was. It mirrored my own reflection. For years I had carried anger like armor, believing it protected me from pain, but in truth, it had only kept love out. We both stood there, stripped of excuses, facing the ghosts that bound us. As the afternoon faded into dusk, we sat outside on the porch. The air was cool, and the scent of pine drifted through the breeze. I told Ethan about the letters, the ones my mother had left hidden in the attic, words she never had the courage to send. He listened quietly, his eyes glistening with the kind of sorrow that only comes when you finally understand what you've lost. "She always believed you'd come back," he said. I nodded, swallowing hard. She believed in everything I couldn't. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of stillness that allows wounds to breathe. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to run. The house, the land, even the air. It felt like it was forgiving me, little by little. When night fell, the sound of crickets filled the silence. I watched the stars emerge one by one, their light steady and patient. Ethan leaned back in his chair, glancing at me. "You know," he said, "this place has a way of healing people, even when they don't think they deserve it." His words lingered, warm and familiar, like an old song you hadn't heard in years but still knew by heart. I thought about that as I went to bed later that night. The moonlight spilled across the room, painting silver patterns on the wooden floor. I opened one of my mother's letters again, tracing her words with trembling fingers. "Love," she had written, "isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about choosing to stay when everything tells you to leave." Tears rolled down my cheeks, slow and unrestrained. For the first time, I didn't wipe them away. Lying there, I realized something simple but profound, that healing isn't found in forgetting, but in remembering without bitterness. Maybe that was what my mother wanted me to understand all along. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer I hadn't spoken in years, asking for grace, not just for me, but for Ethan too. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the old oak tree swaying gently. It felt like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Tomorrow I would face more, the truth, the past, maybe even forgiveness. But tonight, I allowed myself to rest, to breathe in the peace that had waited far too long to return. Somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear my mother's voice again, soft and steady, saying, "Welcome home, sweetheart." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The morning after felt strangely peaceful, as if the house had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The air carried the smell of dew and cedar, and for the first time, I didn't feel the ache of loneliness so sharply. But peace has a way of testing you. Just when you think you've found it, life knocks on your door with something you thought you'd buried for good. That knock came just after noon. I was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie the way Mama used to, when I heard it, slow, deliberate, and far too familiar. My hand froze midair. Ethan looked up from the porch, his expression tensing. When I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Standing there, older but unmistakably him, was my brother, Daniel. He hadn't been back since Mama's funeral. The last time we spoke, our words had been sharp enough to wound. He'd blamed me for leaving, for not being there when our parents needed me most. I'd blamed him for never understanding why I had to go. And now, here he was, hat in hand, eyes tired, wearing the weight of too many regrets. "Hey, sis," he said quietly. The words trembled as they left his mouth. I didn't move, didn't speak. For a moment, it felt like I was looking at a stranger who happened to share my memories. Finally, I stepped aside and whispered, "Come in." The silence that followed could have filled an ocean. He looked around, taking in the living room, the photographs, the signs of life returning to the house. "You fixed the window," he said softly, nodding toward the frame he once broke with a baseball as a kid. I nodded. "Yeah, took me long enough." He smiled faintly, then his eyes landed on Ethan. "Didn't expect to see you here?" he said, a shadow of tension crossing his face. Ethan straightened, voice calm but firm. "Didn't expect to be here either." The two men stared at each other, a moment of unspoken history stretching thin between them. I broke the silence. "We're all here now. Maybe that means something." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Daniel looked down, rubbing the brim of his hat. "Maybe it does," he murmured. We sat around the kitchen table, the same one that had seen laughter, tears, and countless family meals. I served coffee because that's what Mama would have done, though my hands trembled so badly I spilled a few drops. Daniel noticed. Still can't pour straight, he teased, trying to lighten the mood. For a second, I almost laughed. Almost. Then his tone shifted. I came back because I found something, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. My breath caught. I recognized it immediately, Mama's memory box. I thought you took it with you, I said. No, he whispered, setting it on the table between us. I found it hidden under the floorboards in her room. Inside were letters, photographs, and one thing I had never seen before. A folded note addressed to all my children. My fingers shook as I opened it. Mama's handwriting was still beautiful, delicate, the kind that felt like a prayer in ink. My darlings, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am already gone. I know the pain that lingers between you, but I need you to remember something. Love does not die. It waits, it forgives, it begins again. The tears came fast. Daniel's head dropped, shoulders shaking. Ethan turned away, his jaw tight. I could barely breathe. Every word was a knife and a bomb at once. Mama had known even then that we'd need these words someday. Daniel spoke first. I was angry for so long, he said, voice cracking. Thought you left because you didn't care. But I see now you were just as lost as I was. I reached across the table, my hand covering his. We were all broken, Daniel. We just broke in different ways. The weight in the room shifted, lighter somehow. For the first time since her death, it felt like we were sitting at that table as a family again. As evening crept in, the sky turned the color of burnt rose. Daniel stayed for dinner, telling stories of the old days. How Mama used to make us sing before we ate. How Daddy always pretended to hate her cooking, but cleaned every plate. We laughed through tears, the kind of laughter that comes when sorrow finally loosens its grip. After Daniel left, I stood by the window, watching his truck disappear down the dirt road. Ethan came up behind me, his voice low. You did good today. I turned to him. No, I said softly. Mama did. She brought us back together. He smiled, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Peace. We stood there in the quiet, the house humming with life again, and I realized something I hadn't dared believe until now. Maybe coming back wasn't just about facing the past. Maybe it was about building something new. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of Mama's letter echoed in my mind. Love does not die. It waits, it forgives, it begins again. I whispered the words like a promise. Tomorrow, I would go into town and visit her grave. There were things I needed to say, things I'd carried for far too long. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. The moon hung low, glowing softly through the window, and for the first time in years, I fell asleep not haunted by what I'd lost, but thankful for what I was finally beginning to find. The morning dawned gray, heavy with clouds that looked ready to spill tears of their own. I woke before the sun, the letter from Mama still resting on the nightstand, folded neatly as if it were sacred. Maybe it was. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house creak and breathe, wondering if she could somehow still hear me. By the time I stepped outside, a soft drizzle had begun to fall. The road to the cemetery was quiet, the mist hanging low over the fields. I carried a small bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked from the garden, daisies and lavender, her favorites. The drive felt shorter than I remembered, though every turn brought back 100 memories I had spent years trying to bury. When I finally reached her resting place, the world seemed to stop. The oak tree beside her grave had grown taller, its branches stretching wide like a sheltering arm. I knelt down and brushed the rain from her headstone. "Hey, Mama," I whispered. "I know it's been a while." My voice cracked on the last word. For a while, I couldn't say anything else. The silence was both comforting and cruel. I stared at the carved letters of her name, the dates that marked the beginning and end of her story, and realized how small a lifetime looked when written in stone. My tears mixed with the rain as I laid the flowers down. "You'd probably scold me for crying," I said with a shaky laugh. You always said life's too short for tears. The words came slow at first, then all at once. A confession, a release. I left because I didn't know how to stay, I said softly. Every room in that house reminded me of what I couldn't fix. And when Daddy got sick, I just froze. I thought if I ran far enough, I could escape the guilt. I pressed my hand against the cold granite. But I never really did. It followed me, Mama, every single day. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me, as if the world was listening. Daniel came by yesterday, I continued. He brought your letter. You were right. Love waits. It really does. It's been waiting for me here this whole time. I smiled through tears, my chest trembling. I just wish you could see us now. We're trying to heal, Mama. We're trying to come home again. The drizzle turned to a steady rain. I stayed there, soaked and shivering but unwilling to leave. There was still one more thing I needed to say. Something I had never dared to speak out loud. I forgive you, I whispered, for the silence, for not saying goodbye, and I hope you forgive me too, for leaving when you needed me most. The words broke something open inside me, and with that breaking came a strange, peaceful stillness. It felt like breathing after years of drowning. I closed my eyes, and for a brief, impossible second, I could almost feel her there beside me. The warmth of her hand, the faint scent of lavender, the way she used to hum when she didn't know what else to say. It wasn't a sound I heard. It was something deeper, something I felt in my bones, a whisper that said, "You're home now, baby girl." By the time I rose to my feet, the rain had eased into a mist. The world felt lighter somehow, washed clean. I looked back one last time before leaving. I'll take care of the house, I promised. And I'll keep trying one day at a time. When I returned home, Ethan was waiting on the porch. His hair was damp from the rain, and in his hands he held a thermos of coffee. "You went," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yeah, I had to." He handed me the thermos. "How do you feel?" I took a sip, the warmth spreading through me. "Like I can finally breathe again," I said. He smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time we start living again, too." We sat together on the porch, the rain softening into a gentle drizzle. The smell of wet earth filled the air. For the first time, I felt no distance between us, no blame, no fear, just two broken souls slowly finding their way back. After a while, I turned to him. "You ever think about what comes next?" He nodded slowly. "Every day. I've been praying for a second chance, not just with you, but with life itself." His voice was rough with emotion. "I spent years running too, Grace, but I think maybe we were always meant to find our way back here." His words settled deep in me, warm and steady. I looked out at the horizon, the clouds breaking just enough for a sliver of light to shine through. "Maybe that's what forgiveness is," I said. "Not forgetting what happened, but choosing to see something beautiful grow from it." Ethan reached for my hand. For a long time, we just sat there. No need for words. The quiet between us was no longer empty. It was full of something new, something alive. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought of Mama again. Her letter, her faith, her love that stretched across years in silence. I whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Mama. You saved us even now." The rain had stopped, replaced by the distant hum of crickets. The air smelled like renewal, clean, soft, alive. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never was. But for the first time, I believed we could make it. Together. And somewhere deep in the quiet, I felt that same whisper again. Gentle, loving, certain. "You're home now." The first morning after my visit to Mama's grave, the sun broke through the clouds with a hesitant brilliance, spilling golden light across the property. I felt a stirring of something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of ownership over my life, not just the land. The house seemed smaller somehow now, not because it had changed, but because I had changed within it. For the first time, I understood that reclaiming space in my heart required reclaiming space in the world. I stepped into the kitchen, where sunlight lit up the countertops and cast long shadows from the cabinets. The smell of damp earth from the rain yesterday lingered faintly in the air, blending with the aroma of fresh coffee. I set a kettle on the stove and watched the steam curl toward the ceiling, thinking about what had to be done. The house needed more than cleaning. It needed restoration, not just physical, but emotional. Every room held memories of absence and avoidance, each corner echoing the silence of the past. Ethan appeared behind me, leaning casually against the doorframe, a small toolbox in hand. "Ready to make this place ours?" he asked, his voice easy, but there was a determination in his eyes I couldn't ignore. I smiled faintly. "I think so, but I also feel like we're stepping into a history we barely understand." We began in the old study, a room I had rarely entered since my father passed. Dust motes floated in the morning light, and the air was thick with neglect. I pulled on gloves and a mask, letting the silence settle around me. As I cleared old papers, a photograph slipped from between the pages. Mama and my father, laughing on a summer porch decades ago. I held it carefully, tracing the contours of their smiles. "They really were happy once," I whispered. Ethan nodded beside me, quiet and understanding. Weeks passed as we worked together to bring the house back to life. Walls were repainted in soft creams and warm grays, floors scrubbed until the wood gleamed like new. We repaired broken fixtures, replaced old curtains with ones that caught the light in playful waves, and planted flowers along the windowsills. With each action, the house seemed to exhale, letting go of the heaviness it had carried for so long. But restoration was more than physical labor. Conversations with Ethan became therapy, unearthing memories I had long suppressed. "Do you ever regret not staying closer to them?" he asked one rainy afternoon as we patched a roof leak together. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and let myself feel the weight of that question. "Every day," I admitted. "But regret isn't the same as forgiveness. I needed to leave to understand who I was and who I wanted to be now." Outside, the mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. We built a small deck overlooking the valley, imagining summer evenings with laughter and music, a life that felt possible again. I planted a row of lavender along the edge, knowing Mama would have approved. Every choice we made was deliberate, a tribute to both the past and the future we were crafting. Then came the first real challenge. Word had spread through the small town that I had returned and was fixing up the old house. Whispers reached my ears in the grocery store, a shop where neighbors once nodded politely but avoided eye contact. "She's back," someone said. "Didn't think she'd ever come home." Another voice added, "With that boy helping her? Scandalous, if you ask me." I felt a surge of anger but also clarity. This house was not for them. It never had been. It was for me. And if they judged, that was their choice, not mine. Ethan squeezed my hand as we walked to the car, sensing the turmoil in my silence. "Let them talk," he said softly. "We're building something real here, and nothing they say can take it away." The real turning point came one evening when I found an old journal hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. It belonged to Mama, filled with her handwriting in the careful loops of a woman who had loved and suffered quietly. I opened it to a random page and my breath caught. "To whoever finds this, know that love is patient and that home is never just a place, but a collection of moments. Live boldly, even if it means walking alone for a while." Tears blurred my vision as I read on. Mama had known all along that I needed to find my own path, that the house, the land, and even the pain were lessons disguised as obstacles. "She left me a map," I whispered to Ethan, my voice thick. "A map to living fully even when it hurts." He wrapped an arm around me, holding me steady. "Then let's follow it together," he said. Soon after, I received an unexpected visitor. It was my brother Daniel, who had come up the mountain without warning. His eyes were wide, hesitant, almost guilty. I wanted to see the house," he said. "And to see you." I swallowed hard, feeling the years of distance in my chest. "Then come in," I said, stepping aside. The house, freshly restored and imbued with new energy, seemed to soften him. He wandered from room to room, muttering quietly, until he stopped in the study. This is incredible," he said. "I can see why Mama loved this place. I should have understood sooner, but—" His voice trailed off. I didn't interrupt, letting him find the words himself. He turned to me finally, eyes shining. "I've been selfish," he admitted. "All those years I thought I knew what you needed, but I didn't even try. I want to start over, if you'll let me." I felt the old ache of loss and betrayal, but it was tempered by hope. "We can," I said softly, "but only if we're honest about what's happened and what we want now." The day ended with a quiet dinner, simple but intentional. Daniel stayed late, helping us light the fireplace and talking about memories that were no longer painful to revisit. For the first time, the house felt truly alive, not just a restored structure, but a living testament to forgiveness, patience, and the courage to claim joy. As night fell, I stood on the new deck, watching stars shimmer over the valley. Ethan joined me, handing me a cup of tea. "This is just the beginning," he said. I nodded, feeling the weight of truth in that statement. Rebuilding the house had rebuilt something far deeper, my faith in love, in family, and in myself. And somewhere, beneath the canopy of stars, I felt Mama's presence again, quiet, approving, full of the gentle strength I had longed to inherit. The house was no longer just a refuge. It was a declaration that even after loss, after betrayal, after years of silence, life could still bloom anew. Spring had settled into the mountains, turning the landscape into a tapestry of green and gold. The daffodils I had planted were swaying in the morning breeze, and the first songbirds of the season filled the air with music. I felt a surge of pride as I watched the little changes I'd made transform the house and grounds. It was still my sanctuary, but something else was beginning to take root, the possibility of family again, in a way that honored both space and connection. The first weekend visit from my children arrived with cautious energy. Michael, Samantha, and Lily came with the grandchildren, all of them carrying the unspoken baggage of years spent apart. Their arrivals were tentative. They parked in the driveway as if unsure of their welcome, glancing at the house that now radiated life and warmth. I met them at the door with a calm smile, resisting the urge to demand apologies or explanations. Instead, I greeted them warmly, letting the gesture itself communicate the boundaries I'd established. "Mom," Samantha began, stepping forward with hesitance. It's beautiful here." Her eyes traced the line of flowers along the walk, the fresh paint on the shutters, and the new stone path we'd laid toward the garden. Michael nodded, clearly impressed, but silent, his expression carefully neutral. Lily, the youngest, ran ahead, curiosity lighting up her face as she peered into every room, asking questions with genuine interest. We settled into the living room, tea and coffee steaming in delicate cups, and for a few moments, silence filled the space comfortably. Then Michael broke it, his tone measured. "So, we're actually sitting down here, like a family without any distractions." There was a small tension in the air, a mix of relief, anticipation, and unspoken resentment. I smiled, choosing my words carefully. "Yes, we're here to share time, not to replay old habits." My statement hung in the air, and I could see the subtle shifts in their posture as they absorbed it. Samantha looked at her hands folded in her lap, her lips pressed tight, as if deciding whether to trust me. Michael's jaw worked slightly as he processed, and Lily tilted her head, absorbing every nuance of the room, of me, of the house itself. The conversation began cautiously, small talk that circled around current events and work schedules. But as the afternoon wore on, cracks appeared. Michael mentioned a family tradition that I had never agreed to, assuming I would automatically comply. "Mom, we thought we could do Easter brunch here," he said, eyes hopeful. I took a breath, reminding myself to maintain the new boundaries. "I'm happy to host, but I need advance notice and commitment that everyone respects my schedule," I replied evenly. The surprise on his face was palpable, a mix of defensiveness and awakening. Samantha, ever sensitive, spoke next, her voice tinged with guilt. "I know we've been taking you for granted, Mom. I didn't realize how much you've done for us without asking for anything." She looked down, twisting a napkin between her fingers. I acknowledged her honestly. "I know, and I appreciate that you're recognizing it. But appreciation without respect isn't enough. That's what's changing here." The shift in tone, firm but loving, was something they hadn't experienced before. The children, sensing my resolve, began to open up. Lily shared stories from school, her voice bright and curious. And for the first time, I noticed she wasn't just reporting facts. She was seeking connection. "Grandma, can you show me how to plant those herbs in the garden?" she asked. I glanced at Ethan, who had come along to help with practical matters, and he nodded with encouragement. Together, we walked to the garden beds, explaining soil, sunlight, and the rhythm of care. Each seed we planted became a quiet metaphor for trust, fragile, demanding patience, yet full of promise. Dinner was another carefully navigated moment. I had prepared a meal with attention to both taste and presentation, not extravagant, but intentional. Michael commented on the menu with restrained admiration, and Samantha complimented the table settings, a subtle acknowledgement of my independence and thoughtfulness. Yet as we ate, the tension lingered beneath the surface. Old arguments threatened to surface when Michael accidentally criticized a dish, or when Samantha mentioned a past holiday conflict. I intervened gently, redirecting the conversation toward shared memories that were neutral or positive, reminding myself that this weekend was about progress, not perfection. Later, as dessert was served, Daniel, who had decided to join at the last minute, entered the room quietly. His presence brought a sudden, unexpected weight to the gathering. He looked around, taking in the scene, and then approached me. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted softly. "But I want to be here. For you, for the family." I felt the room shift subtly with his sincerity. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an apology that erased years of distance, but it was a step. The kind of step that mattered more than words. The grandchildren, sensing the adults' hesitation, began their own interactions. They laughed together, ran through the halls, and explored corners of the house they hadn't seen before. Lily took Daniel's hand at one point, guiding him to help plant a small row of wildflowers along the edge of the deck. Observing their interaction, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't dared to imagine in years. The walls of the house seemed to absorb the laughter, the chatter, and the tentative apologies, transforming the space into a living testament of effort and willingness to reconnect. By evening, the atmosphere had softened considerably. We gathered around the fireplace, warm mugs in hand, and Michael finally spoke with the kind of vulnerability that surprised us all. "I didn't realize how much I've missed," he said quietly. "Not just being here, but being with you, really being with you." Samantha leaned in, her own voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was too busy, too focused on everything else. I see now that we neglected what really matters." The firelight reflected in their eyes, and for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that the long years of distance could be bridged. There were still barriers, old habits, and lingering resentment, but we had begun the work. The weekend was not perfect, but it was authentic, and authenticity, I realized, was far more precious than perfection. As I watched them leave at sunset, cars rolling down the winding driveway, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The house, once a refuge from exclusion, had begun to serve its greater purpose, teaching boundaries, fostering respect, and providing a space where reconciliation could take root. I stood on the deck, the scent of pine and wildflowers in the air, and allowed myself a small private smile. This was just the beginning. The bonds were fragile, yes, but they were alive. And sometimes, the most important growth comes from small, persistent acts of courage, honesty, and love, the kind that doesn't happen all at once, but builds slowly, irrevocably, toward something enduring. The week after the family's spring visit brought a quiet sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Each morning, the sun crept through the towering pines, illuminating the house I had carefully curated, every corner a testament to boundaries reclaimed, independence nurtured, and the subtle rebirth of family. I moved through my days tending the garden, practicing watercolor painting on the sunlit porch, and preparing meals that celebrated both flavor and presence. Yet beneath the tranquility, a whisper of tension lingered. I knew the delicate progress with my children could unravel if one misstep occurred, and my heart remained vigilant, ready to navigate the inevitable friction of old habits colliding with newfound respect. Thursday afternoon brought a sudden, unexpected phone call from Samantha. Her voice trembled slightly, a mix of urgency and hesitation. "Mom, we need to talk. Can we come by today?" I studied the clock, noting the late hour, the midweek intrusion. Normally, I would have hesitated, but intuition told me this was important. "Of course," I replied calmly. "I'll be here. Come when you're ready." By late afternoon, the familiar hum of engines announced their arrival. Michael drove, flanked by Samantha and the two younger grandchildren. The tension was palpable, heavier than it had been during their previous visit. I greeted them with my standard warmth, careful not to overcompensate with emotion that could be misread. They entered the house, lingering in the living room, avoiding direct eye contact. The air was thick with anticipation, and I sensed that something long buried was about to surface. Samantha spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "Mom, there's something you should know about Dad's estate, about the house. We haven't been entirely honest with you." My pulse quickened. I had always suspected there were unresolved issues, subtle hints, inconsistencies. But I hadn't expected a confession to arrive so suddenly, so bluntly. I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "It's complicated," she added. "We didn't mean to hurt you, we weren't ready to face it ourselves." Michael took a deep breath, finally meeting my gaze. "Mom, when Dad passed, there were things we didn't handle properly. We assumed you wouldn't care, or that you wouldn't want to be involved. But that was wrong." I kept my expression neutral, though inside a storm of emotions swirled. Betrayal, relief that the truth was coming out, and a cautious hope that honesty might finally allow us to move forward. They explained that for years, after Dad's death, they had made decisions regarding the family property and finances without consulting me. Decisions they now recognized as selfish, born from grief, fear, and an unconscious desire to protect themselves from uncomfortable emotions. There were letters, legal documents, and bank statements they presented, each item a tangible marker of their previous missteps. Their apologies were halting, sincere, and yet shadowed by the weight of what had been left unspoken. I listened, absorbing each revelation with careful attention, resisting the urge to react impulsively. The house, the sanctuary I had fought to build, suddenly felt both like a fortress and a witness to the fractures that remained. The grandchildren played quietly in the corner, their presence a grounding force, a reminder that the past was only one chapter and the future still unwritten. Daniel, who had unexpectedly arrived later in the afternoon, joined us. His eyes were bright, reflecting the seriousness of the moment. "I should have said something years ago," he admitted. I thought silence was easier than confrontation, but it only made things worse. "I see that now." The siblings exchanged glances, the shared guilt tangible. For a moment, the room was heavy with unspoken regrets, each of us caught between the desire to heal and the fear of reopening old wounds. I finally spoke, my voice steady, though threaded with emotion. "I appreciate your honesty. It's long overdue, but it's a start. What matters now is how we move forward, not how far we've fallen in the past." My words were met with relief and surprise. They hadn't expected me to respond without anger or reproach. I continued, emphasizing that while their mistakes had caused pain, the power to rebuild rested not in blame, but in willingness to act with integrity from this point forward. As the conversation deepened, they revealed additional layers of secrecy, financial mismanagement, miscommunications about family heirlooms, and past assumptions that I had been indifferent to their choices. Each disclosure was a small tremor, shaking the fragile structure of trust we had been attempting to rebuild. Yet in the midst of the tension, there was also clarity, the foundation we were establishing through boundaries, respect, and intentional communication gave us a framework to confront these truths without collapse. Dinner that evening was quiet, reflective, and unexpectedly intimate. I prepared a simple meal, letting the flavors speak of care rather than grandeur. As we ate, the conversation shifted from past mistakes to shared memories, small moments of childhood laughter, and experiences we had once taken for granted. The grandchildren, sensing the gravity yet finding safety in the household rhythms, participated with earnest questions and unguarded joy. After the plates were cleared, we gathered in the living room by the fire. Michael and Samantha remained seated close, their shoulders still tense but easing gradually as dialogue unfolded. Daniel sat slightly apart, reflective yet present, a silent anchor for the others. I encouraged each of them to share their personal reflections, their insights about our family dynamics, and their hopes for the future. The room was heavy with the gravity of accountability, yet lightened by the courage it took to speak honestly. Lily, perceptive beyond her years, finally broke the tension with a simple question. "Grandma, why did it take so long for us to really see each other?" Her innocence pierced through the layers of guilt and unspoken resentment. I smiled gently, touched by the clarity of her insight. "Because," I said softly, "we were all waiting for the right time, and sometimes the right time isn't a date on the calendar, but a moment when we're ready to truly listen." Her nod, slow and contemplative, signaled understanding. By nightfall, the air had shifted. The weight of past mistakes was acknowledged, the truth laid bare. And though forgiveness was still tentative, the first steps toward authentic reconciliation had been taken. They left quietly, the evening's revelations heavy in their minds, but tempered by a newfound respect for boundaries, honesty, and mutual care. Standing on the deck afterward, I breathed deeply, the cool mountain air filling my lungs. The stars shimmered above, distant yet steady, a reminder that growth often follows turbulence and that light emerges even after long nights. This weekend had been painful, yes, but necessary. It had forced confrontation, demanded courage, and tested the strength of the bonds we were trying to rebuild. Yet I knew, with a quiet certainty, that we were on a path that could lead to something profoundly meaningful. A family relationship founded not on obligation or assumption, but on respect, honesty, and intentional love. Spring had fully arrived in the mountains, painting the world in shades of vibrant green and delicate pastels, a constant reminder that life, even after long winters, finds a way to renew itself. I wandered through the garden in the early morning, checking the cedar frames we had built for vegetables and herbs, the soil turned and ready for planting. James was already there, kneeling beside a raised bed, the sunlight catching the angles of his face, his hands streaked with earth. "Morning," I called softly. "Ready to see if my green thumb or lack thereof can make something grow?" He chuckled, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Talent isn't everything. Persistence and attention matter more. You've got both." I smiled, feeling that familiar warmth of companionship that had grown gradually over months, a bond that moved gently, deliberately, away from haste or expectation. The rhythm of our work together became a meditation. Measuring, leveling, filling beds with rich soil, planting seeds carefully, labeling them with delicate markers. It all felt symbolic, like tending not just to plants but to the life I was reclaiming, to relationships that needed nurture, patience, and trust. Each seed placed was an act of faith in growth unseen, in possibilities not yet realized. And just as plants required time and care, so too did the delicate reconciliation with my children. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, can we come by tomorrow? Ethan has been asking nonstop, and we'd like to do it properly this time." I paused, sensing the subtle difference in tone from previous years, the careful phrasing, the genuine request rather than presumption. "Tomorrow works perfectly," I typed back, meaning it sincerely. Over the past months, I had come to appreciate that this was more than a casual visit. It was a test, a chance to witness if the slow shifts we'd set in motion could endure. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright. I prepared a breakfast of fresh fruit, homemade pastries, and strong coffee, placing each item with attention to detail, mindful of creating an experience of care and respect rather than obligation. When the family arrived, there was a noticeable lightness to their demeanor, a reflection of the tentative lessons learned since Christmas. The children greeted me politely, waited for invitations, and seemed acutely aware of the subtle authority my home represented, not in dominance, but in self-possession, in boundaries clearly established. Ethan, the youngest, ran ahead to the vegetable garden, eyes wide with curiosity. "Grandma, can we plant some carrots too?" he asked eagerly, kneeling beside the beds. I laughed softly, handing him a small trowel. "Of course. Every garden needs helpers." His energy was infectious, drawing smiles and laughter from the adults. Watching him, I realized how much presence mattered, how small acts of inclusion and respect could repair subtle rifts that words alone could not reach. The conversation during breakfast flowed with surprising ease. Samantha asked about my watercolor painting, her tone genuinely interested rather than dismissive. Michael inquired about the new cooking techniques I had mastered, and Daniel shared stories of work projects, punctuated with subtle acknowledgement of my input and advice. The dynamic was markedly different from past years. Interactions were considered attentive and respectful. For the first time, I felt my children approaching me as equals, not just as extensions of the roles I had occupied in their lives. After breakfast, we moved outside to work on the garden together. James supervised with gentle guidance, helping the children understand planting techniques while I assisted where needed. There were moments of humor, carrots slipping from fingers, dirt smudged across cheeks, and moments of quiet reflection as we all paused to admire the progress of our labor. It was physical, shared effort, a tangible metaphor for rebuilding connections. The laughter, shared struggles, and small triumphs began to knit us together in ways words had never fully accomplished. Later in the afternoon, as we rested on the deck with iced tea, Samantha leaned back, brushing strands of hair from her face. "Mom," she said tentatively, "I don't think I've ever really understood what this place means to you." "It's more than a house, it's you," I nodded, touched by her observation. "It's where I can be fully myself, without having to negotiate roles or expectations. And it's where I hope you'll see me not just as your mother, but as someone with my own dreams, my own interests, my own life." Daniel, quiet until then, added thoughtfully, "I see that now. And I think we've all been afraid of stepping into that space, afraid it would make us outsiders." The acknowledgement, spoken openly, carried a weight that settled gently in the room. It was not shame, but recognition, a turning point where old habits could begin to be replaced with conscious respect. As evening fell, I served a dinner slightly more elaborate than our breakfast, intentionally setting the table with care. Fine china, crystal glasses, silverware polished to a soft gleam, all elements chosen to honor the effort and presence of everyone gathered. We dined with attention, conversation flowing naturally around stories of childhood memories, plans for the garden, and the quiet joys of small successes. For the first time in years, the meal felt like a true gathering of hearts rather than a routine obligation. After clearing the table, we gathered in the living room for coffee and dessert. The grandchildren sat close, attentive to the stories unfolding, their curiosity gently guided by the adults who had learned to listen rather than dominate conversation. Victoria, the eldest, observed me thoughtfully. "Grandma," she said, "I feel like I'm finally seeing you. Not just as someone who organizes our holidays, but as you." I smiled, profoundly moved by her insight. "That's all I've ever wanted," I replied. "For you to know the whole me, not just the parts convenient for tradition or expectation." The day ended with small acts that carried enormous significance. The children helped tidy the house without being prompted, laughter-filled corners that had once been silent with tension, and subtle gestures of appreciation and respect threaded through every interaction. When they finally left for the evening, the mood was markedly lighter than any previous departure. There was no lingering resentment, no unspoken frustration, only the quiet satisfaction of progress made tangible through action and presence. As I closed the door and turned back toward the warmth of the kitchen, I realized that the mountain home had served its purpose once again. Not as a shield from my children, but as a foundation for genuine engagement. Each shared meal, each thoughtful conversation, each collaborative effort in the garden became a bridge, slowly spanning the gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of pine and soil, carrying with it a sense of possibility. Before retreating to bed, I paused at the window, gazing at the garden where seeds planted hours earlier would begin their journey unseen beneath the soil. I understood then that relationships, much like gardens, required patience, care, and persistence. The changes we had initiated, though fragile and tentative, were real, and each small act of attention strengthened the bonds we had once feared were irreparably broken. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the home I had built and the life I was nurturing, I felt a profound sense of hope. Not the fleeting hope of idealized perfection, but the enduring hope of growth, renewal, and love carefully cultivated over time. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, catching the dust motes in its golden sweep, and I felt a quiet thrill at the promise of a new day. The garden, tenderly planted the previous day, glimmered with dew, each tiny shoot a testament to patience and care. I sipped my coffee slowly, relishing the moment, aware that today would be different, not just because of who would be visiting, but because of the change that had quietly taken root over the months. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth awakening. It seemed to whisper a truth I had long known but only recently embraced, that life, like relationships, thrives when nourished with attention, respect, and authenticity. By mid-morning, the familiar sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of my children and grandchildren. Michael and Samantha exchanged polite smiles as they stepped out of the car, careful not to presume, their gestures measured with thoughtfulness. Ethan and Lily ran ahead, their laughter echoing against the mountain slopes, a sound both joyous and healing. I welcomed them warmly, a sense of calm authority threading through my words and gestures. This time there was no tension, no defensiveness. The air between us was lighter, buoyed by months of quiet work, phone calls, small visits, gestures of inclusion, and the intentional assertion of boundaries. As we gathered around the breakfast table, conversation flowed naturally. Samantha asked about my new watercolor painting, genuinely curious. Daniel inquired about the gardening project, and Victoria commented on the home itself, noticing details she had overlooked in the past, the sunlight catching the crystal vases, the careful arrangement of books, the garden visible through the large kitchen window. There was an awareness, a mindfulness in their interactions that had been absent for years. I realized once again that the mountain home had done more than give me space. It had reshaped how my family viewed me. No longer just the mother or grandmother defined by obligation, I was Eleanor, a full, multifaceted person with thoughts, talents, and desires of my own. After breakfast, we moved outside to the garden, where James had prepared additional beds for herbs and flowers. The children eagerly participated, planting seeds, watering carefully, and laughing when soil slipped through fingers. There was a rhythm to our work, a harmony between generations, each act of tending the garden doubling as an act of tending to one another. Small moments spoke volumes, Michael pausing to admire a row of planted carrots, Samantha kneeling beside Ethan to teach him how to gently pat soil around a seed, and Victoria taking notes about planting techniques, already envisioning her own garden projects. I watched them with a swelling heart, struck by the realization that this day was a culmination of incremental change, the transformation of interactions, the rebuilding of trust, and the creation of shared memories that would outlast any conflict or misunderstanding. After lunch, We gathered in the living room for coffee and dessert. I had prepared individual chocolate soufflés, another skill from my recent cooking classes, and the children's delight was evident. "Grandma, this is amazing," Lily said, eyes wide. "I've never had anything like it." I smiled, humbled by her enthusiasm. The moment was more than culinary. It was a bridge, a signal of connection and shared joy. Conversation meandered through recollections of family stories, the discussion of hopes and dreams, and the laughter that had been too rare in our previous gatherings. There was no rush, no distraction from devices, no need to entertain artificially. Authenticity ruled the day. As evening approached, I guided everyone to the deck, where the fading sunlight turned the sky a delicate rose and lavender. We sipped hot chocolate, watching the mountains and the garden, and I noticed subtle changes in each of my children. Their posture, their attentiveness, their willingness to listen and engage, all reflected a respect for me that was genuine rather than performative. Daniel turned to me quietly. "Mom, I don't think I realized how much we missed out on by assuming we already knew everything about you." His voice was earnest, tinged with regret but tempered by hope. I reached out, squeezing his hand gently. "The past cannot be changed, but the present is ours to shape," Samantha added softly. "It feels different. Not like we're trying to measure up or stay out of trouble, but like we're actually connecting." Victoria nodded. "We're seeing you, really seeing you, and it makes me think about how we might change the way we live our own lives." Her words struck me profoundly. I realized that this was more than reconciliation. It was a ripple effect. By reclaiming my identity and asserting boundaries, I had modeled authenticity, courage, and self-respect. The lesson was unmistakable. Genuine relationships require both openness and clarity, a willingness to respect one another while honoring oneself. Later, as the house quieted and the children prepared to return to the lodge for the night, Lily lingered. "Grandma," she said, voice tentative, "I've been thinking about what you said last Christmas, about being true to yourself and living intentionally. It made me realize I've been living to please others more than myself. I want to change that." I felt a surge of pride and tenderness. "That's all I could ever hope for, Lily, to see you find your own voice, your own path, while still embracing the love that surrounds you." She hugged me tightly, and in that embrace, the months of struggle, growth, and reconciliation crystallized into something profound: hope, continuity, and the possibility of lasting connection. Alone after their departure, I walked through the mountain home, noting the garden, the carefully curated spaces, and the subtle touches of personal expression I had cultivated. This house had become more than shelter. It was a living testament to courage, independence, and renewal. Through it, I had learned that exclusion could be transformed into empowerment, disappointment into opportunity, and loneliness into a foundation for authentic relationships. I understood that my happiness was no longer contingent on the approval of others. It was grounded in self-respect, intention, and the deliberate cultivation of meaningful connections. As twilight descended and stars emerged above the mountains, I reflected on the journey. The most profound lesson was simple yet powerful. By asserting boundaries, embracing one's full identity, and inviting others into one's life with clarity and authenticity, relationships can evolve beyond expectation. Small, consistent actions, conversations, gestures, shared work, attentive listening, accumulated to create profound shifts. Life does not demand perfection, but it does reward courage, patience, and integrity. Before closing the day, I drafted a message to my audience on my new YouTube channel, where I had begun sharing my journey of self-discovery, family reconciliation, and personal growth. I typed thoughtfully, "If you've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or constrained by the roles others assign you, know that change is possible. Boundaries, authenticity, and deliberate attention to the people and passions in your life can transform even the most challenging relationships." Subscribe to follow my journey, and perhaps find inspiration to start your own. Hitting send, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that my experiences could serve not only my family, but also others seeking courage and perspective. The mountains were quiet now, but they hummed with life, growth, and possibility. The garden beds held potential beneath their soil. The house carried warmth and history, and my family, imperfect yet striving, had taken meaningful steps toward connection and understanding. I stood by the deck, inhaling the crisp night air, the stars twinkling like distant promises. I realized, with a deep and abiding sense of peace, that life's greatest triumphs are not measured in accolades or perfection, but in the reclamation of self, the courage to love authentically, and the patience to nurture the fragile bonds that make us human. This Christmas, and every day after, was no longer defined by absence, hurt, or expectation, but by presence, intentionality, and the quiet, unshakable joy of living fully, loving openly, and being truly seen. And in that realization, I smiled, ready to greet whatever new chapters awaited with courage, grace, and unwavering hope.